Have you ever wondered what happens when a miracle walks on four legs through a snowstorm? Tonight, I'll take you to Maple Ridge, a small mountain town buried under 15 degrees below zero, where a forgotten man and a mother dog crossed paths in the middle of a raging blizzard. It's a story about survival, faith, and the light that love can ignite even in the coldest night. So, before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story of hope can travel across the world. The storm had swallowed Maple Ridge whole. Wind howled through the pine valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it shards of snow that clawed at windows and rooftops. The town, nestled between Montana's mountains, lay silent under the weight of an unforgiving blizzard. It was the kind of cold that froze sound, that turned breath into clouds of glass, that made even time itself seem to shiver. Along the outskirts of town, where the last streetlight flickered weakly against the darkness, a lone figure moved through the white, small, determined, trembling. Nova was no ordinary dog. She was a 3-year-old German shepherd with a coat once sleek as burnished gold, but now clumped with frost. Her eyes, a piercing amber, reflected both courage and exhaustion. She had once belonged to a family who owned a small farm beyond the ridge, a family who had loved her when crops were green and laughter was plenty. But when the farm went bankrupt, they had packed their things, boarded their truck, and driven away, leaving behind the wooden barn and the faithful creature who didn't understand why her name was no longer called. In the weeks that followed, Nova had survived on instinct and loyalty. The barn had grown colder each night, the straw frozen stiff beneath her belly. 7 tiny bodies now huddled against her newborn pups, barely 2 weeks old. They were small, blind, and fragile, each one whimpering softly against the icy wind. She named them in her heart, though no human would ever hear those names. The bold one who wriggled toward warmth she called Scout. The smallest, who cried the most, she called Tiny. And the one with the patch of white fur over its chest she called Luna, after the pale moon that hung above their nights of hunger. When the storm came, the barn no longer offered shelter. The wind seeped through every crack, and the roof groaned beneath the weight of snow. Nova could feel the temperature falling, her own body trembling despite her thick fur. She curled herself around her pups, trying to shield them, but the chill crept in like a living thing. She knew they would not survive another night there. And so, as the world outside howled, Nova did the impossible. She rose. With careful precision, she picked up one pup gently by the scruff and stepped into the snow. The path toward town was a blur of white and shadow. Snow rose to her chest, and the air burned her lungs. She made trip after trip, carrying each pup from the barn to the hollow beneath an old wooden bridge. There, shielded from the direct wind, she dug a shallow nest in the snow and pressed her body against the tiny forms. The river below the bridge whispered faintly beneath the ice, a ghost of sound in a world gone still. For a moment, it felt almost safe. But as the night deepened, the storm thickened again, and flakes began to seal the bridge's underside like a tomb. Nova's instinct screamed, "Move." Her breath came in harsh clouds as she looked toward the faint glow on the horizon. The town. Lights shimmered like distant stars, warm and unreachable, but somewhere in that warmth, perhaps, was hope. She rose once more, nudging her pups awake, and began to walk. Every few yards she stopped to check them, to nudge Tiny when he stumbled, to lick Luna's frost-covered nose. Her paws bled from the ice crust, and her tail dragged behind her, but she pressed on. Occasionally, she passed the ghostly outline of a fence or a mailbox buried in snow, silent witnesses to her journey. The storm had erased the world, leaving only her tracks, a fragile trail of love against the void. Hours passed. The lights of Maple Ridge drew nearer. She could smell smoke, wood burning somewhere, faint traces of cooking. Her ears pricked at the muffled bark of another dog far away, the faint hum of a generator. Civilization. Salvation. She reached the first row of houses, each one shuttered tight against the blizzard. Nova padded to a porch, pawed at the door. Nothing. Her whimper was swallowed by the wind. She moved to another house. Same silence. People were asleep, or too frightened to open their doors to a stray. The pups cried softly, their small bodies shaking. Nova pressed them close, licking their fur to keep them awake. Her strength was fading. She moved along the snow-covered street, past the shuttered diner, past the gas station buried in drifts. The sign from Maple Ridge Hardware swayed overhead, its paint chipped by years of storms. Still she walked, still she refused to give in. And then, light. A warm flicker from a cabin perched at the very end of the road, half hidden by trees. The window glowed amber through the snow, the way the sun might glow through fog. Nova lifted her head. Her legs shook, but she pressed forward. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, her body no longer her own, but driven by something deeper, a promise only mothers understand. By the time she reached the wooden steps of the porch, dawn was breaking, the storm still raging but pale light beginning to filter through. The cabin was old, its walls made of hand-cut logs and its roof thick with snow. Smoke curled from the chimney. The air smelled of pine and firewood. Nova climbed the first step, her paws slipping on the ice, and let out a low, hoarse bark. It was not a call for help. It was a plea for mercy. Inside, a man stirred from sleep, though Nova could not see him yet. His name was Eli Turner, and his story was one of silence and sorrow. But for now, the world held only the faint sound of puppies crying beneath the storm and the weary heartbeat of a mother who refused to surrender. Nova lowered herself beside her pups under the porch, curling around them one last time as snow fell softly over their bodies. Her eyes closed, not in defeat, but in faith, that behind that glowing window there might still be kindness left in the world. Outside, the storm raged on, but somewhere within that storm, something unseen had already begun to change. The storm had not yet passed when Eli Turner woke to the faintest sound, a broken whimper carried by the wind. For a long moment, he lay still on his worn leather couch, the embers in the fireplace glowing dimly beside him. The cabin was steeped in that peculiar silence known only to men who live alone. A silence filled not with peace, but with the ghost of conversations that would never happen again. Eli was 43, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been strong and still carried the remnants of that strength like an echo. His hair, once chestnut brown, had begun to gray around the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard lined a face carved by both mountain winds and grief. His hands, rough, scarred, and cracked from years of chopping wood, seemed built for work, yet they trembled slightly whenever he looked at the framed photograph above the mantel. In it, a woman and a young girl smiled beneath a summer sun. Sarah, his wife, had been a nurse, short, kind-eyed, always laughing at the smallest things. Their daughter, Lily, had inherited that same light. But 3 winters ago, a rescue mission in the high range had gone wrong. A snowslide had buried their cabin before help could arrive. Eli had found their bodies days later, frozen together beneath the snow. Since then, he had lived alone at the edge of Maple Ridge, tending his woodpile, his silence, and his sorrow. He didn't go into town much anymore. The locals called him the mountain ghost. He didn't mind. People were noise, trees didn't judge. His only companions were the pine forest, the crackle of fire, and the occasional crow that perched by his window. But that morning, something else called to him. Another sound, so faint it could have been the wind. Yet Eli's instincts, sharpened from years as a forest rescue ranger, told him it was not. He rose slowly, pulled on his old parka, and pushed open the front door. The cold hit him like a slap. Snow fell in heavy flakes, muffling every sound except that soft, desperate cry again. Eli stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the frost, scanning the white landscape. Then he saw movement, a flicker of gold beneath the steps. He crouched down, brushing aside snow. There, huddled in a tight circle, was a German shepherd, her fur crusted with ice. Around her squirmed a cluster of tiny puppies, barely alive, their weak cries cutting through the storm. For a heartbeat, Eli didn't move. The sight hit him like a memory. Sarah had loved dogs. They had once kept a shepherd named Max who followed Lily everywhere, from creek to meadow. Eli could almost hear his daughter's voice again. "Dad, promise we'll always keep them safe." The ache in his chest returned, sharper than the wind. "Hey there, girl," he said softly, his voice rasping from disuse. "You're far from home, aren't you?" Nova lifted her head weakly. Her amber eyes met his, tired, wary, but still burning with a will to protect. She gave a low growl, not of aggression but of exhaustion and fear. Her body was trembling, her breath shallow. Eli held out a gloved hand, palm open. "It's okay," he murmured, the words clumsy but gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a long moment they simply looked at each other, a broken man and a mother who refused to give up. Then, as if something unseen passed between them, Nova lowered her head again. Trust, fragile and wordless, began to form in the frozen dawn. Eli moved quickly. He fetched a blanket from inside, wrapping it around the dog and her pups. They were light, almost weightless, too light. He carried them to the barn behind the cabin, where his tools and stacks of split wood were kept. The air inside was still cold, but out of the wind it felt like mercy. He laid them on an old workbench covered with burlap, and began lighting the small stove in the corner. As the fire caught, warmth returned slowly to the room. Nova stirred, pressing closer to her pups. Eli opened a can of meat from his pantry, one of the few he had left, and placed it near her. She sniffed it, hesitated, then ate with quiet desperation. He smiled faintly. "That's it, girl. You've earned it." The puppies, 7 of them, had started to move again, their tiny bodies twitching as warmth seeped into their bones. Eli crouched, counting them with the careful precision of a man long used to search and rescue. 1, 2, 3, 7. 7 miracles. He didn't name them yet. That, he thought, was her job. Hours passed, and the storm outside began to ease. Eli sat on an overturned crate, watching the small family breathe. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. He realized, almost with guilt, that he felt needed again. That evening, he returned to the cabin and brought out more blankets. Nova followed him with her eyes, cautious but calm. He could see intelligence in her gaze, a quiet awareness that this man meant safety. He wondered what she had been through, who had abandoned her, how far she had walked in this storm to reach his door. There was something almost divine about it, as if fate had led her here, to this forgotten man in a forgotten cabin. Before he turned in for the night, Eli looked back at the barn one last time. Nova was curled around her pups, eyes half closed. He whispered, "Sleep easy, girl. You're safe now." Later, lying in bed, Eli couldn't shake the sound of the soft breathing from the barn. It mixed with the crackle of fire and the sighing wind, creating something he hadn't heard in years: life. The next morning, sunlight broke weakly through the clouds. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world wrapped in a quilt of white. Eli trudged to the barn, carrying warm milk and a few scraps of bread soaked in broth. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a low bark, guarded, protective, but no longer afraid. Nova stood, her head high, her tail slightly wagging. The pups were nursing, tiny paws kneading her belly. The sight made Eli smile, something he hadn't done in a very long time. "Good morning," he said softly. "Guess we made it through the night." As he set the milk down, one of the pups, a curious little one with a streak of darker fur, stumbled toward him. Eli crouched, letting it sniff his finger before it climbed onto his hand clumsily. He chuckled under his breath. "Well, aren't you brave?" Nova watched, ears perked but calm. For the first time, she allowed a stranger near her children. Eli looked around the barn, the morning light spilling across the floorboards. Something in that moment felt holy, quiet and sacred, like a prayer answered without words. He realized then that the cold emptiness inside him had cracked just a little to let the warmth in. As he sat there, surrounded by the sound of small breaths and the faint rustle of straw, Eli Turner, the man who had stopped believing in miracles, did not yet know that his life had just changed forever. He only knew that the fire in his heart, long extinguished, was beginning to burn again. And outside, over the snowbound hills of Maple Ridge, the storm clouds began to part, revealing the first timid rays of morning. Morning light drifted through the thin veil of frost on Eli Turner's cabin windows. Outside, the forest glistened in silence, each pine bough burdened with snow, each ray of sun filtered through mist like light through cathedral glass. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, biting and sharp, a reminder of how fragile life could be in the mountains of Montana. Eli pulled on his wool sweater, the same gray one Sarah had knitted years ago, its sleeves stretched and frayed from time. He made coffee over the old iron stove and watched the dark liquid steam upward like breath from a tired soul. For the first time in years, he didn't drink it alone. From the barn came faint sounds, whimpers, rustling straw, the shuffle of paws. Eli smiled without realizing it. He poured some warm milk into a pan, mixed in bits of bread, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the yard. Inside the barn, the world felt alive. Nova lifted her head when he entered, her amber eyes wary but calmer than before. The pups were huddled together, their bellies full, their tiny tails twitching as they dreamed of warmth. "Morning, girl," Eli said softly, crouching beside her. "You've done good, real good." He set down the pan. Nova sniffed the air, then looked up at him as if deciding whether this man was worth trusting again. Finally, she lapped at the milk. Eli chuckled. "That's right. We're partners now, whether you like it or not." He looked over the pups, one by one. The bold one, the same curious little furball who'd climbed his hand yesterday, crawled toward him again, yipping. Eli reached out, and this time Nova didn't stop him. He lifted the pup gently, its fur soft and warm against his rough fingers. "You're brave," he murmured. "Bet you're the explorer, scout, that's what I'll call you." One by one, he gave them names. Luna, with the pale fur patch like moonlight, Bear, the largest and sleepiest, Maple, whose nose was perpetually dusted white, Ash, lean and restless, River, who liked to nestle near his hand, and Tiny, the smallest of all, whose quiet heartbeat pulsed like a whisper. He looked at Nova again. "And you," he said softly, "you're Nova, the name fits you, a star that burned through the storm." The German shepherd tilted her head, ears perked as if she understood. For the first time, she wagged her tail. Not much, but enough to stir something deep within Eli's chest. The day passed quietly. Eli repaired an old blanket to line the pup's nest. He chopped wood, fixed the latch on the barn door, and every so often looked back to see Nova watching him. There was intelligence in her eyes, but more than that, a kind of faith that made him uneasy. He didn't feel worthy of it. At dusk, the sky turned amber, and the smell of pine smoke filled the air. Eli sat on the porch steps, sharpening his knife. He hadn't done that in months. It felt like preparing for life again, not just waiting for death. As he worked, he found himself talking softly, something he hadn't done since the accident. "I don't know why you came here, girl," he said toward the barn. "Maybe just luck, or maybe—" He paused, staring at the falling snow. "Maybe Sarah sent you." That thought made him flinch. He hadn't spoken his wife's name out loud in nearly 3 years. The silence afterward was heavy, but not as empty as before. Night came. Eli fed Nova one last time and checked the stove. The pups were asleep, their tiny bellies rising and falling in rhythm with their mothers. As he watched, Scout stirred, slipping away from the nest and toddling toward the half-open door. "Hey now," Eli whispered, getting up, but before he could reach him, Scout squeezed through the gap and vanished into the night. Panic jolted through him. He grabbed his coat and lantern, calling out, "Nova, stay!" But Nova didn't stay. With a bark, sharp, urgent, she darted out the door, her paws slicing through snow like arrows. Eli followed, his lantern light bouncing wildly between trees. The forest was a maze of shadows. He could barely see through the swirling flurries. "Scout!" he shouted. "Nova!" His breath smoked in the freezing air. Then, a faint cry, a yelp. He ran toward it, slipping over roots, heart hammering. The light of his lantern fell on a cruel sight. Scout, caught in an old steel trap, half buried beneath the snow, whimpering. Nova stood over him, teeth bared, tugging at the metal with desperate growls. Blood stained the snow. Eli dropped to his knees. "Easy, girl! Easy!" He set the lantern down, reaching carefully toward the trap. It was rusted, stiff with ice. "Hold him still!" Nova obeyed, pressing her body against the pup to keep him from thrashing. Eli wedged his knife beneath the hinge, forcing it open. Metal screeched and his hand slipped, slicing his palm. He didn't care. He pried again, harder. Finally, the trap gave way. Scout was free. Eli wrapped the trembling pup in his scarf and pressed a hand against the bleeding paw. "You're okay, little guy. You're okay." Nova nuzzled the pup, licking his wound. Eli looked at her, breathless. "You're one hell of a mother," he whispered. They trudged back through the snow together, man and dog, side by side under the cold stars. When they reached the barn, Eli cleaned Scout's paw, then his own. Nova lay beside her pup, eyes heavy but calm. Eli sat down beside her, exhaustion sinking in. "You saved him," he said softly. "You didn't hesitate." His voice broke slightly. "I couldn't save mine." Nova turned her head, resting it against his knee. Her warmth spread through him like a quiet benediction. For a long while, Eli just sat there, staring at the fire flickering in the stove. The snow outside whispered against the roof, soft and steady. Finally, he spoke again, more, to himself than to anyone else. "Maybe God hasn't forgotten me after all." Nova lifted her eyes toward him, and in them he saw something beyond comprehension. Faith, loyalty, grace. He reached down, stroking her fur gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me what love looks like." Outside, the storm had ended completely. The moon rose above the ridge, pale and perfect. In that stillness, something inside Eli Turner, the man who had lost everything, began to thaw. By the time spring sunlight touched the peaks of Maple Ridge, Eli Turner's cabin had become something of a rumor in town. To most, he was still the recluse who talked to no one, who lived off firewood and canned beans, who turned down every invitation to church or market gatherings. But whispers had begun to travel down Main Street, about the man who'd taken in a stray dog and her 7 pups, about the bark that echoed each dawn from the ridge, like a hymn rising from snow. At first, people dismissed it. "Just another drifter with too much time," said the grocer. "Maybe he's losing his mind out there," added the postmaster. Yet curiosity in a small mountain town spreads faster than fire on dry pine. One morning, a letter from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Committee arrived at Eli's doorstep, sealed and officious, demanding he surrender the pack of stray animals to animal control for safety and sanitation reasons. Eli read it once, then folded it in half, placed it under a mug, and went back to chopping wood. Nova watched him from the porch, her coat glinting in the pale sunlight. One ear bent as if she too understood the insult in those printed words. The pups, now grown enough to tumble and bark around the yard, rolled in the melting snow, a blur of fur and energy that made the old cabin look alive again. He'd tried to ignore the talk, tried to pretend he didn't care what the town thought. But when 2 men from animal control drove up the mountain 3 days later, their truck tires crunching against the gravel, something hardened inside him. The younger officer, polite but detached, stepped out first. "Mr. Turner, we've had reports." Eli cut him off. "I know what you've had. False ones. Sir, you're keeping 8 dogs without license, and I'm keeping a family," Eli said, his voice calm but edged. "They're not strays. They're survivors." Nova stood at his side, her body tense, head high. The younger man hesitated, seeing the intelligence in her eyes. The older one muttered, "We're not here to argue, just to take them down to the center." Eli folded his arms. "You'll have to take me first." There was something in his tone, steady, unwavering, that made them back off. After a brief exchange, they left, promising to report the refusal. When their truck disappeared around the bend, Eli turned to Nova and exhaled slowly. "Guess we'll be famous soon, girl." That evening, he sat by the fire, rubbing his tired hands. He knew the town had rules, but he also knew that some things, the warmth in those tiny bodies, the faith in Nova's eyes, were beyond rules. The next day dawned cold and still. Children from nearby cabins were playing near the frozen pond down the slope, a thin sheet of ice glinting like glass. Among them was Mia, an 8-year-old with wild curls and bright mittens, daughter of the local carpenter. She loved to sneak over to watch Nova and the pups from afar, giggling when they chased each other through snowdrifts. That morning, Nova barked softly as she watched Mia glide clumsily across the ice. Eli, splitting logs nearby, smiled faintly. "She reminds me of Lily," he murmured. His chest tightened at the name. But in the span of a heartbeat, laughter turned to screams. The ice cracked like thunder, and Mia vanished beneath the surface. The other children froze, terrified, too afraid to move. Eli dropped his axe and ran. "Mia!" he shouted, boots pounding against the snow. But Nova was faster. In one impossible leap, she hit the ice near the hole, her claws scrabbling for purchase as she plunged her muzzle into the freezing water. "Mia, hold on!" Eli tore off his coat and dove in beside her. The cold was a knife that seized his lungs. He reached out, fingers brushing fabric, and then Nova's jaws closed gently on Mia's jacket, pulling, her powerful body straining against the current. Eli grabbed both and kicked upward. They burst from the water, gasping. Nova dragged Mia toward the shore, while Eli heaved them onto solid ground. He laid the girl flat, his hands trembling. "Come on, kid, breathe," he said hoarsely. He pressed her chest, once, twice, then, coughing. Water spilled from her mouth. She was alive. The sound broke him. Eli fell back, panting, the cold biting through his soaked clothes. Nova stood beside him, dripping, trembling, her breath forming clouds of steam. Her eyes met his, and he whispered, "You did it again." By the time neighbors arrived, drawn by the commotion, Eli was wrapping Mia in his coat. The girl's father, Caleb, stumbled down the slope, pale as snow. "My God! Eli, thank you! Thank you!" "Don't thank me," Eli said, looking at Nova. "Thank her." That night, word spread through Maple Ridge like wildfire. "The old hermit's dog saved a child," the baker told everyone at the diner, "dragged her right out of the lake." Within hours, the same townsfolk who'd judged Eli came knocking, not with threats, but with blankets, food, medicine. They peeked into the barn, where Nova lay wrapped in quilts, her body shaking with fever from the icy plunge. Eli knelt beside her, pressing his forehead to her fur. "You'll make it, girl. You've got to." He stayed there through the night, feeding her warm broth with a spoon, refusing to sleep. The pups whined softly nearby, huddled in a circle. Outside, snow fell again, soft this time, gentle, like blessing instead of punishment. Dawn came slowly. Eli's eyes burned from exhaustion. He touched Nova's paw. It was still. He whispered, "Please." Then, movement, a twitch. Her tail stirred weakly, her eyes opened. He laughed, the sound half sob and half prayer. "There you are," he whispered. "There's my miracle." When the townsfolk heard, they cheered. Mia came up the mountain that afternoon with her father, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. "For Nova," she said shyly. Eli smiled, lifting her up so she could place them beside the dog's bed. That evening, the cabin glowed with light. The people of Maple Ridge, who had once turned away from one another, now gathered around a single story, the story of a man and a dog who had reminded them that faith wasn't found in sermons or laws, but in acts of love that asked for nothing in return. Eli watched them leave, his heart full. When he looked down, Nova was asleep again, surrounded by her pups, the fire's warmth flickering across her fur. For the first time in years, the loneliness inside him was gone. Outside, beyond the ridge, the wind sang softly through the trees. It was not the sound of a storm this time, but of something reborn. Winter loosened its grip on Maple Ridge slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The snow receded inch by inch, revealing the brown grass beneath, brittle and tired from months of cold. The air softened, the wind carried the scent of pine sap and thawing earth. Streams once frozen solid now trickled again, and birds began to return, tentatively at first, their songs thin but full of promise. Eli Turner stood on his porch, hands in his pockets, watching the last remnants of snow melt from the eaves of his cabin. The sunlight caught in his gray beard, and his eyes, once dull with grief, held something that looked almost like peace. Behind him, laughter broke through the quiet. The pups were playing in the yard, tumbling over each other in clumsy joy. Bear had grown into a stocky, slow-moving protector. Maple was quick and clever, always the first to steal a stick. River splashed through every puddle he could find, and Tiny, still the smallest, barked fiercely as if to prove that size had nothing to do with courage. Nova watched them from the porch steps, her fur sleek again after the illness that had nearly taken her. She carried a faint scar on her foreleg from the icy rescue that winter night, but it only seemed to make her prouder, stronger. She had become a symbol in town, though she didn't know it. Eli sat beside her, scratching behind her ears. "Looks like they're ready for the world," he murmured, Nova pressed her head against his hand, eyes half closed. There was something regal in her posture, something that made Eli think of angels. Down in town, Maple Ridge was changing. The story of the shepherd dog who saved a child had spread far beyond the local diner. Newspapers from neighboring counties had written about her. Visitors sometimes drove up the winding mountain road just to glimpse the cabin where the miracle had happened. But Eli didn't care about the attention. What mattered to him was that people had softened. He'd seen it himself. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid each other now stopped to talk. The church that had stood half empty on Sundays was full again. And every week, someone left a bag of food or medicine at his door with a note. For Nova and her babies. The man who once lived in silence now greeted others with a nod and a half smile. And for the first time in 3 years, Eli Turner went to town not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The hardware store bell jingled as he stepped inside. The owner, Mrs. Caldwell, a plump woman with silver curls, beamed when she saw him. "Well, if it isn't our mountain hero." Eli shook his head, embarrassed. "That'd be Nova, not me." "She's the talk of the county," Mrs. Caldwell said, handing him a new saw blade. "You've done a good thing, Eli. The whole town needed that story." "Didn't plan for it," he said quietly. "Just happened." She smiled kindly. "The best things usually do." That afternoon, a truck rumbled up his driveway. It was painted white with red letters on the side. Montana Search and Rescue Training Division. A tall man in his mid-30s climbed out, his uniform neat, his expression open but assessing. "Mr. Turner," he called, extending a gloved hand. "Name's Lucas Gray. I train rescue dogs for the Montana Search and Rescue Team. Heard about Nova from the paper, and from the sheriff, who swore she's something special." Eli shook his hand. "She's that, all right." Lucas knelt, snapping his fingers softly. Nova tilted her head, approached, and sniffed him curiously. "Good girl," Lucas murmured, studying her stance. "Alert posture, strong focus, steady breathing. She's got the instinct." "She's got heart," Eli said. "That too," Lucas smiled. "I'd like to offer her a spot in our training program. We could use a dog like her, quick thinker, brave, loyal. She'd be saving lives across the state." Eli froze. The idea hit him harder than he expected. Nova had become family. His reason to wake up. The heartbeat of his quiet days. The thought of letting her go felt like losing Sarah and Lily all over again. He looked at her. She was watching him, tail wagging, as if waiting for his answer. Lucas's voice softened. "You'd still see her, of course. We keep our dogs nearby. Missoula base. She could visit, but—" He hesitated, searching Eli's face. "It's clear she was born for this. Not every dog carries that kind of light." Eli didn't speak for a long time. He looked out over the ridge, the trees glittering under melting snow, the horizon blazing gold with the late afternoon sun. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that old ache again, but it was different this time. Not the ache of loss, but of letting go. He knelt beside Nova, cupping her face in his hands. "What do you think, girl?" he whispered. "You ready to save the world?" She licked his hand once, eyes steady, almost answering him. Eli laughed softly, though his throat tightened. "Yeah, I thought so." When Lucas returned a week later with his truck, the whole town came to see Nova off. Children brought her ribbons. Mia hugged her neck and cried. Even the sheriff, a stoic man rarely seen smiling, knelt to pat her head. Eli loaded her favorite blanket into the truck, his fingers lingering on the fabric. "You remember what I told you?" he asked quietly. "Do your job, help people, and don't forget where home is." Nova barked once, sharp and bright, like a promise. As the truck rolled down the mountain road, Eli stood watching until it disappeared beyond the trees. The wind picked up, scattering petals from early blooming wildflowers across the yard. For the first time since that dark winter, the sound didn't feel lonely. That night, Eli lit a fire and sat by the window, staring into the dark where the road vanished. He felt sadness, yes, but underneath it, something cleaner, something like grace. He whispered into the quiet, "Go on, girl. The world's waiting for you." A full year had passed since the blizzard that had brought a German shepherd to Eli Turner's door. Maple Ridge, once buried under silence and suspicion, now thrived with warmth and laughter. Children played on the thawed streets, The diner's bell chimed from dawn till dusk, and every house along the ridge kept a lantern by the window through the long winters, each one a quiet tribute to a dog named Nova. Eli's cabin, too, glowed with soft light. But now, the yard that once rang with the yips and howls of puppies lay still. The pups had grown and found homes around the valley. Bear now lived with the sheriff, Maple with the local school teacher, River with Mia's family. Each morning, Eli saw them bounding through the snow, spreading the same joy their mother once had. Nova had been gone for nearly 10 months, training under Lucas Gray at the Montana Search and Rescue Division. Letters arrived now and then, typed reports, training photos, notes from Lucas about her progress. "She's a natural," one letter read. "Tracks sent through wind like no dog I've seen." Another said, "She doesn't quit, ever. Reminds me of someone you once described." Eli kept those letters stacked neatly in a wooden box beside the fireplace, next to Sarah's photo, and the old rescue badge he had worn years ago. Sometimes he would sit there at night, running his fingers over the envelope edges, imagining Nova racing through snowfields, nose to the wind, saving lives the way she'd once saved his soul. It was late February when the phone in his cabin rang, a rare sound. Eli hesitated before picking up. Turner speaking. "Eli, it's Lucas," came the voice on the other end, tight with static. "I thought you'd want to know. Nova's team just completed a mission up near Glacier Point. Big one. Group of climbers went missing in a storm." Eli's hand tightened around the receiver. "She's all right?" "She's more than all right," Lucas said, and Eli could hear the pride in his voice. "She found them. Tracked the scent under 10 feet of snow. We'd have lost them without her." For a long moment, Eli couldn't speak. He just stared out the window where the mountains loomed, white, endless, alive. He felt something welling up in his chest, too large to name. "She did it," he finally whispered. "She did," Lucas said. "And the media's caught wind of it. They'll air the story tonight. Channel 7, 6 o'clock. That evening, Eli built a fire, pulled his old recliner close, and switched on the small TV he hadn't used in months. The screen flickered, grainy, but clear enough. A reporter stood in front of a snow-covered ridge, voice brimming with excitement. "Earlier today," she began, "Montana Search and Rescue successfully located 3 climbers trapped in a blizzard near Glacier Point. The team credits their discovery to one extraordinary canine, Nova, a German shepherd who braved sub-zero temperatures to lead rescuers to the site." The footage shifted. Eli's breath caught. There she was, Nova, fur-dusted white with frost, tail high, eyes bright with purpose. She bounded across the snow beside Lucas, her paws sure, her head lifted toward the wind. When the camera zoomed in, Eli could almost see the fire in her gaze, the same fire that had lit his cabin that first night. The reporter continued. "Nova was originally rescued in last year's blizzard by a retired ranger named Eli Turner, who later entrusted her to the Search and Rescue Division. Today, Nova's courage has saved 3 lives, and perhaps reminded us all of what bravery and faith look like." The segment ended with a still image. Nova standing atop a snow ridge, the wind whipping her fur, a halo of sunlight breaking through the clouds behind her. Eli sat in silence long after the broadcast ended. The fire crackled, casting warm light across the room. He wiped his eyes slowly and laughed under his breath. "You really did it, didn't you, girl?" A week later, the town of Maple Ridge gathered in the square. Snowflakes drifted gently from a pale sky as Mayor Collins addressed the crowd. "We're here," he said, "to honor the spirit that changed this town, not through fame, but through faith." In the center of the square stood a tall iron post, its base engraved with a simple plaque. "No act of kindness ever melts away. It becomes light." Above it hung a brass lantern that would remain lit through every winter from that day forward. Eli stood among the townsfolk, his hat in his hands. Around him were familiar faces. Mia, clutching a small flag, Caleb, her father, Mrs. Caldwell, smiling through tears. Even Lucas Gray had driven up from Missoula to be there. When the mayor called his name, Eli stepped forward slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. He cleared his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, "but I guess sometimes words find you when you stop hiding from them." He looked up at the lantern. "I used to think light was something you lost. When my family died, when I stopped believing, I thought darkness was all there was left. But then, his voice faltered, then steadied. Then one stormy night, God sent a stray to my door, and she reminded me that light doesn't disappear. It just moves, waiting for someone to find it again. The crowd stood silent except for the soft hiss of snow. Eli smiled faintly. Nova found her purpose. Maybe we all have one. Maybe it's not about what we lose, but what we give back. He paused, his eyes glistening. So tonight, when this lantern burns, I hope we remember her, not just as a hero, but as a reminder that love, no matter how small, always leaves a mark. He stepped back. The mayor nodded to Lucas, who struck a match and touched it to the lantern's wick. The flame caught, flickering gold against the white night. As the light spread, the townsfolk began to hum a hymn, low, old, and trembling like the first heartbeat after a long sleep. Children pointed toward the mountains where the stars shimmered faintly through the snow clouds. For an instant, it seemed as if the ridge itself glowed. Eli closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Nova, for everything." When he opened them, he thought, just for a second, that he saw her there on the ridge above the town, tail high, watching over them. Then the wind shifted, and she was gone, leaving only snow and starlight. That night, back in his cabin, Eli lit a smaller lantern and placed it by the window. The flame danced gently against the glass, a twin to the one in town. He sat beside it with a quiet smile. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of a bark, distant, joyful, eternal. And on the mountains of Maple Ridge, the light of kindness burned on. In the quiet heart of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always come wrapped in thunder or light from heaven. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a loyal heart, a warm bark in the cold, or a stranger who chooses kindness when it matters most. Just like Eli and Nova, we all face our own storms, and sometimes God sends help in ways we least expect. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little faith today. Leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love and miracles. May God bless you and your family, and if you believe in the power of His light, type Amen in the comments.